You grab a carton from the servo on a Friday afternoon, crack one open ice cold, and assume you're drinking something brewed the way the ads have always implied. Barley, hops, water, thyme. Here's the thing worth actually sitting with. A lot of what's in your hand went through a manufacturing process built far more around cost efficiency and shelf consistency than around traditional brewing craft. Today we're counting down 6 commercial Australian beers, breaking down exactly what's really going into them and why some of the biggest names in the fridge might not deserve the loyalty they've earned purely on nostalgia. Here's a question a lot of people have quietly wondered without ever chasing down the answer. Why does a session of proper craft beer leave you feeling relatively fine the next morning, while the same number of standard drinks off a commercial slab leaves you feeling like you got hit by a truck? It's not entirely in your head. And it's not just about how much you drank. Some of it genuinely comes down to what's in the brew and how it was made. But yes, it's about as deep in Australian culture as anything gets. Backyard barbecues, Friday knockoffs at the local, the classic server run before a long weekend, which is exactly why it's worth actually knowing what you're drinking rather than running on brand loyalty inherited from decades of advertising. A huge share of the beer sold in this country comes from a small number of enormous, often foreign-owned conglomerates, prioritizing volume, shelf life, and margin, and those priorities shape the finished product in ways most drinkers never think to question. So here's the plan. 6 commercial lagers, counted down, each one broken down honestly. What's actually in the process, what that means for flavor, and how you feel the next day, and whether the reputation matches the reality. Let's start at number 6. Carlton Draft is about as ubiquitous as pub beer gets in this country. The tap you'll find in nearly every venue from Melbourne to the middle of nowhere. And there's a real brewing technique behind why it tastes remarkably consistent no matter which pub you're standing in, and it's worth understanding rather than just accepting. Large-scale commercial breweries commonly use a process called high-gravity brewing, where a batch is fermented at a higher alcohol concentration than the final product, then diluted with water down to the target strength before packaging. It's a genuinely mainstream, well-documented in industry technique used by both macro and craft producers, primarily because it lets a brewery squeeze significantly more finish volume out of the same fermentation vessel capacity. It's not inherently a mark of low quality, but it is a cost and efficiency decision, not a flavor decision. And diluting a beer down after fermentation can measurably thin out body and mouthfeel compared to brewing directly to strength. Where this shows up for the average drinker is in consistency rather than complexity. Carlton Draught is built to taste the same, ice cold, from a chilled tap in any pub in the country, which is a genuinely difficult engineering achievement. The trade-off is that letting it warm up even slightly tends to expose a thinner, more metallic character than a beer brewed directly to strength without the dilution step typically shows. It's drinkable and reliable. It's just optimized for a very specific kind of reliability, not for depth. Fepia is arguably the single most culturally loaded beer brand in the country, the definitive blue-collar icon. Decades of advertising built entirely around mateship and shared identity, which makes it worth separating the marketing from the actual grain bill. Like most large-scale commercial lagers in Australia, VB's fermentable sugars come from a mix of malted barley and adjunct sugars, commonly sourced from cane or corn, rather than exclusively from malt. Using adjuncts alongside malt is a completely standard, legal, and widely used brewing practice across the entire commercial beer industry globally, not something unique to VB. And it's typically used because it's cheaper per unit of alcohol produced than sourcing that same fermentable sugar entirely from malted grain. Here's the part worth understanding rather than just accepting as marketing. A beer built more heavily around adjunct sugar tends to carry less of the complex character, the deeper malt backbone, the richer mouthfeel that comes specifically from barley. It's not that adjunct-heavy beers are unsafe or fundamentally flawed. Brewing scientists generally agree the difference shows up mainly in flavor complexity and body, not in any meaningful health distinction. But it does mean paying pub prices for a beer built substantially around one of the cheaper fermentable sugar sources available is worth knowing, especially for a brand whose identity is built so heavily around tradition and heritage rather than around its actual grain bill. Queensland's default mid-strength and one of the best-selling beers in the country by volume, XXX Gold exists to solve one specific engineering problem. How do you hit a lower alcohol target, generally sitting around 3.5%, without the beer tasting hollow and watery in the process? The honest answer is that it's a genuinely difficult problem, and mid-strength commercial lagers generally solve it with a combination of lighter hopping, adduct-heavy fermentable sugars, and careful dilution to land precisely on target strength. That combination keeps the beer easy drinking and sessionable, which is exactly the brief, but it also means there's inherently less malt character supporting the final product compared to a full-strength beer, simply because there's less total fermented material in the glass to begin with. This isn't really a scandal so much as straightforward physics. A beer built to be lower in alcohol at scale, using cost-efficient ingredients, is always going to lean lighter in body than a full-strength beer built around a heavier malt bill. Where it's worth being a genuinely informed consumer is recognizing that easy drinking in commercial marketing language often means built to be inoffensive at scale, which isn't the same thing as built for flavor. Both are legitimate goals for a brewery to pursue. They're just different goals, and it's worth knowing which one you're actually paying for. Dry-style beers occupy a strange, slightly misunderstood corner of the commercial lager world, and Hahn's Super Dry is one of the most recognizable examples on Australian shelves. Understanding what dry actually means chemically changes how you think about the style entirely. Dry beers are typically brewed using additional enzyme treatment, commonly amylase, applied during fermentation to break down complex carbohydrates that would normally remain in a standard beer, converting them into simple sugars the yeast can fully consume. The result is a beer with very little residual sweetness and a notably higher attenuation, meaning the yeast is eaten through nearly all the available sugar. Using enzymes this way is a legitimate, widely documented, and completely legal brewing technique used across the food and beverage industry, not a hidden or illicit shortcut. The trade-off with understanding is what gets sacrificed along the way. Residual sugars and unfermented carbohydrates aren't just about sweetness. They also contribute meaningfully to body, mouthfeel, and the sense of fullness in a beer. Strip nearly all of it away through enzyme treatment, and what's left is a beer that's crisp and light, but often thinner and less satisfying on the palate than the marketing language of dry and crisp might suggest. It's a legitimate style choice with real technical reasoning behind it. It just isn't the health-conscious premium positioning some of the marketing around dry beers tends to lean into. Here's a detail that surprises a lot of people who grew up with Two Hays as a proud New South Wales institution. Like most major Australian beer brands today, it now sits under a large multinational beverage company's ownership. Following a series of acquisitions across the local brewing industry over recent decades, Lion, which owns Two Hays, XXX, and Hahn among others, is itself owned by Kirin, the major Japanese beverage conglomerate. A matter of public corporate record, not a secret. This kind of consolidation isn't unique to Two Hays or even to Australia. It's a pattern that's played out across commercial brewing worldwide, where a handful of large conglomerates have steadily acquired historic regional and national brands. The practical effect tends to be standardization, centralized brewing protocols, ingredient sourcing built around cost efficiency at scale, and production processes designed for consistency across large volumes rather than regional character. That's not automatically a bad outcome for drinkers who value reliability, but it does mean the local heritage brand framing a lot of these beers still lean on in their marketing sits somewhat at odds with the actual corporate structure and production reality behind the label today. Worth being clear here too, there's nothing improper or unusual about this ownership structure, and Lion has operated openly as a subsidiary of Kirin for years. It's simply a detail worth knowing if part of what you're paying for, consciously or not, is a sense of supporting a specifically local, independent Australian brewer. And at the top of the list, an import that's become such a fixture of Australian summer that most people never stop to ask a fairly obvious question. Why does virtually every Corona come with an expectation that you'll shove a lime wedge into the bottleneck before drinking it? The answer here is genuinely one of the more interesting pieces of brewing chemistry in this entire list, and it's well documented. Corona is packaged in clear glass rather than the brown glass most breweries use specifically because it blocks damaging light wavelengths. Hop compounds in beer are highly sensitive to ultraviolet and visible light exposure, and when they're struck by light through clear glass, they undergo a genuine chemical reaction that produces a compound called 3-methyl-but, 2-in-1-thiol, the same general class of compound called 3-methyl-but-netusian-1-thiol, the same general class of compound responsible for skunk spray, which is exactly why the resulting off flavor is universally described in brewing science as being light-struck, or more colloquially, skunked. The lime wedge tradition that's become so central to how Corona is consumed didn't originate as a purely aesthetic or flavor-enhancing custom. A widely repeated explanation among brewing enthusiasts is that the acidity and aromatic oils in the lime help mask exactly this kind of light exposure off flavor. Whatever the precise historical origin of the custom, the underlying chemistry is real and well established. Clear glass packaging leaves a beer measurably more vulnerable to this specific kind of flavor degradation than brown glass would, and it's a packaging trade-off, not an accident, given that darker glass options have always been available to any brewery choosing not to use them. None of this means commercial beer is dangerous, or that reaching for something familiar off the shelf makes you a bad judge of what you like. Plenty of people genuinely enjoy the exact flavor profile these brewing techniques produce, and there's no shame in that. But there's a real difference between choosing a beer because you understand what's actually in the process and choosing it purely because decades of advertising built an emotional shortcut between a logo and a feeling of national identity. High gravity dilution, adjunct heavy fermentation, engineered dryness, corporate consolidation, and light exposure packaging choices. These are the real mechanics sitting underneath 6 of the most recognizable names in Australian beer fridges. None of it is illegal, none of it is hidden from anyone willing to actually look, and none of it makes these beers unsafe to drink. It just means the story on the label and the story in the brew house aren't always quite the same one. Next time you're loading the Sky, it's worth at least considering swapping one commercial 6-pack for something from an independent local brewery built around a full malt bill and traditional technique, just to genuinely compare the difference for yourself. If one of these 6 surprised you, drop a comment and let me know which one. And if you're into this kind of honest, detail-driven consumer breakdown, subscribe, because there's plenty more of this deep dive investigation still to come.